Inside the Sala Bologna, 12 ambassadors sat facing a pope who had arrived before them. The doors were closed from the outside. 2 Swiss guards remained in the corridor, and no cameras were allowed inside. Pope Leo XIV looked across the semicircle and delivered the sentence that would soon escape the room and ignite an international crisis. We cannot remain silent anymore. Within hours, the words reached foreign ministries. Within a day, they spread across major news networks. But the public did not yet know what had been placed before those diplomats, why 3 governments were already preparing a response, or why the Pope had decided that silence now carried a greater danger than diplomatic retaliation. On Saturday morning, May 15th, 2026, a confidential briefing document arrived at the Vatican Secretariat of State. It was 31 pages long, carried no official author, and contained material that could not be dismissed as speculation. Inside were satellite images, witness testimony transcripts, financial records, bank transfers, shell companies, and media blackout orders bearing the signatures of senior government officials. The document connected 3 groups of 20 nations to a coordinated effort to suppress humanitarian reporting in active conflict zones. It did not merely suggest that governments and private interests had concealed suffering. It identified names, dates, payments, corporate channels, and official instructions that showed how information had been restricted before it could reach the wider world. By the time the folder reached Cardinal Matteo Bruni, the crisis was no longer theoretical. Bruni read the entire dossier once, then returned to the first page and read it again. He did not call ahead, request an appointment, or send an assistant to announce him. Carrying the folder himself, he walked directly to the private study of Pope Leo XIV, knocked once, entered, and placed the document on the desk before Robert Francis Prevost. The Pope opened the folder and began reading without speaking. Bruni remained standing, while nearly 40 minutes passed, watching the Pope move through the satellite images, testimony, financial trails, and signed orders in complete silence. His expression shifted slowly from concentration to something harder and more settled, as if the evidence had removed the final space for hesitation. When Pope Leo finally looked up, he did not ask where the dossier had come from or how dangerous its contents might become. He gave one instruction: "Bring me the ambassadors." On Sunday, May 16th, formal diplomatic communications left the Vatican for 12 ambassadors accredited to the Holy See. They were not invited to a ceremonial audience or asked to attend a routine consultation. Each message directed its recipient to appear for a closed session at the Apostolic Palace the following morning. The wording immediately drew attention inside several embassies. Vatican correspondence normally relied on careful courtesy, layered titles, and language designed to preserve dignity on every side. This summons was unusually direct, referring to urgent matters of shared moral obligation and ending with a sentence that removed any doubt about the seriousness of the meeting. His Holiness expects candor. 3 ambassadors attempted to avoid the session. 2 cited scheduling conflicts, while a third gave no response at all. Their hesitation lasted only a few hours before a second communication arrived, this time from the Pope's personal secretary rather than through the ordinary diplomatic channel. The follow-up message remained brief and controlled. It stated that Pope Leo understood their hesitation, considered their attendance essential, and would regard any absence as a matter worthy of public notice. The warning did not accuse them of wrongdoing, but it made the consequence impossible to misunderstand. Within the hour, all 3 ambassadors confirmed that they would attend. Their schedules were changed, vehicles were assigned, and instructions were issued for a meeting whose purpose had still not been disclosed. By Sunday evening, 12 diplomatic missions knew that the Pope expected them in person, but none had been told what evidence would be waiting inside the room. Monday morning arrived under a warm, overcast sky that made Rome feel unusually still. The 12 ambassadors came separately in unmarked vehicles and entered through a side entrance rarely used for diplomatic functions. No press pool waited outside. No official photographers recorded their arrival, and no public schedule explained why so many senior representatives had been called into the Apostolic Palace at the same hour. Vatican staff escorted them through corridors that most of the diplomats had never seen. They passed restoration workshops, private working rooms, and a narrow stone hallway carrying the smell of old wood and candle wax. The route avoided the ceremonial spaces used for public audiences and moved them deeper into an area where protocol gave way to control. The ambassadors were brought into the Sala Bologna, a room normally reserved for intimate papal audiences. 12 chairs had been arranged in a semicircle, all facing a single wooden chair at the front of the room. Pope Leo XIV was already seated when the first diplomat entered. That detail carried its own message. Under ordinary Vatican protocol, the Pope would arrive after the guests had taken their places, allowing the room to rise and the ceremony to begin around him. By waiting for them instead, Pope Leo removed the usual rhythm of deference and made clear that the meeting had already begun on his terms. He greeted each ambassador with a restrained nod. There were no handshakes, no formal pleasantries, and no attempt to soften the atmosphere before the discussion began. When the final diplomat took her seat, the heavy doors were closed from the outside. 2 Swiss guards remained in the corridor beyond those doors. Inside the room were only Pope Leo, the 12 ambassadors, Cardinal Matteo Bruni, and 1 note-taker from the Secretariat of State. No cameras were present, no press officers stood nearby, and no official Vatican photographer had been permitted to document what was about to happen. Pope Leo allowed the room to settle before speaking. His posture remained still, his expression unreadable, and his voice carried the low, measured directness that had already defined his papacy. There was no opening prayer, no diplomatic welcome, and no ceremonial introduction. He looked across the semicircle and told the ambassadors that each of them represented a nation claiming to value human dignity. Some placed that principle in constitutions, others repeated it in treaties, and all invoked it when doing so served their national interests. Then he paused and told them that he was about to show them what their silence looked like. Cardinal Matteo Bruni rose from his chair and began placing copies of the 31-page dossier into the hands of the ambassadors. Paper moved quietly around the semicircle as each diplomat received the same evidence that had reached the Pope 2 days earlier. Pope Leo XIV did not wait for anyone to begin reading. He started with the first case and spoke without changing his tone. In a Southeast Asian nation, government-aligned militias had forced more than 200,000 people from a rural region containing valuable rare earth minerals. The displacement had not occurred in open view because access to the area had been systematically restricted. International journalists had been denied entry. Local reporters who attempted to document the removals had been arrested, while the few stories that escaped the region were attacked through coordinated disinformation campaigns. According to the dossier, part of that campaign had been financed by a European defense contractor with close connections to a government belonging to the Group of 20. The Pope moved to the second case with the same measured precision. In a North African country, a famine affecting nearly 1 million people had been kept from receiving sustained international attention. Aid organizations had been stopped at the border, even as the humanitarian situation continued to deteriorate. Satellite images showed grain shipments being redirected away from civilian need and toward military installations. The financial records traced payments from a Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund to senior officials within the affected country's interior ministry. Those payments coincided precisely with the orders that restricted reporting and enforced the media blackout. Then Pope Leo reached the third case. In a Latin American nation, indigenous communities had been quietly removed from protected land to clear the way for a lithium extraction project. The project was supported by a consortium involving companies headquartered in 3 of the countries represented inside the room. The dossier contained internal communications from executives connected to that consortium. Those messages showed that company leaders had been warned about human rights violations before the project continued. They proceeded because they believed the story would never receive enough international attention to threaten their interests. 2 ambassadors shifted visibly in their seats as the Pope described those communications. Others lowered their eyes toward the pages in front of them, but no one interrupted. The evidence had connected government action, private capital, controlled information, and human suffering within the same chain. Pope Leo completed the presentation of all 3 cases in less than 20 minutes. He did not raise his voice, point toward any diplomat, or accuse a specific person in the room. He simply finished the final detail, leaned back in his chair, and allowed the evidence to remain between them. The silence lasted for almost a full minute. No papers moved, no aid entered, and no ambassador attempted to break the tension immediately. The room had been summoned to discuss moral obligation, but the Pope had placed something more dangerous before them: documented responsibility. The French ambassador was the first to speak. He began carefully, thanking the Pope for the seriousness of the evidence, while warning that each case involved complex geopolitical conditions that required a measured and nuanced response. His language was precise, diplomatic, and designed to slow the momentum inside the room without openly challenging the authority of the man seated before him. Pope Leo XIV stopped him before the argument could develop. He did not raise his voice or show irritation, but the interruption was firm enough to close every other conversation before it began. He told the ambassador that nuance was what governments offered when they intended to do nothing, and that children were dying while officials continued to calculate. The temperature of the meeting changed immediately. The French ambassador fell silent, and several diplomats lowered their attention to the dossier in their hands. No one attempted to defend the phrase that had just been rejected, because the Pope had made clear that the discussion was no longer about language. Pope Leo then told the ambassadors why they had truly been summoned. He was not asking them to sign a statement, promise an investigation, establish a committee, or schedule another round of consultations. He had already decided what would happen next. Within 72 hours, he said, he would deliver a public address. During that address, he would present the substance of the 3 cases, identify the nations involved, name the companies connected to the evidence, and release the supporting documentation. The announcement removed the possibility that the meeting could end as another confidential diplomatic exchange. Several ambassadors began speaking at once. The Italian ambassador raised both hands in a restrained effort to calm the room, while the British representative leaned forward and warned in a low voice that public disclosure could produce severe diplomatic consequences. The Pope listened until the overlapping voices had stopped. He repeated the phrase, diplomatic consequences, slowly, as though testing the weight the diplomats had assigned to it. Then he told them that they were speaking about diplomatic consequences to a man who answered to God. His greater fear was that the Church would become complicit through inaction while suffering continued behind official silence. The Pope did not withdraw the deadline or soften the scale of what he intended to release. He remained seated as the ambassadors absorbed the fact that persuasion had failed before they had been given the opportunity to attempt it. The danger was no longer contained inside the Sala Bologna, because the Pope had placed a clock over every government represented there. The meeting ended without a formal communiqué, and the 12 ambassadors left through the same discreet entrance. Within minutes, encrypted messages were moving between embassies. Within 1 hour, at least 4 foreign ministries had opened emergency consultations over the Pope's plan to name governments and companies publicly. Within 3 hours, the United States Department of State requested an urgent call with Archbishop Giovanni Ferrara, the Vatican Secretary of State. Pope Leo XIV had already instructed him to accept the call, listen carefully, and answer with only 4 words. When the officials finished speaking, Ferrara replied, "His Holiness is resolute." The pressure was also building inside the Vatican. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle warned that diplomatic missions in at least 6 countries could be endangered, while Cardinal Christoph Schönborn sent a handwritten appeal for caution. Even Cardinal Matteo Bruni, who had carried the dossier to the Pope, asked whether gradual disclosure might achieve the same result with less risk. Pope Leo listened to every objection without dismissing the danger to clergy, missionaries, aid workers, and diplomatic personnel. He understood that retaliation could move quickly from official statements to direct pressure on Catholic institutions. After considering the warnings, however, he refused to reduce the address. Instead, he expanded it. The 3 cases would remain, but they would now become part of a wider accusation against the international system that had learned to tolerate suffering by keeping it unseen. On Tuesday, Pope Leo XIV returned to the same desk where he had first read the dossier. He rejected the idea of limiting the address to 3 isolated cases and began writing a broader accusation against what he called structured indifference. The speech would no longer describe only what had happened. It would explain how governments, financial systems, and corporate interests had learned to make suffering disappear from public view. He wrote the text himself, in longhand on plain white paper. Staff members who saw the early drafts understood that it was unlike the pastoral and theological addresses normally prepared for a papal audience. The language was controlled, direct, and prosecutorial, as though the Pope were arranging evidence before the conscience of the world. He described an architecture of silence in which suffering was not merely ignored, but deliberately made invisible. He wrote about financial systems that allowed money to cross borders while civilians remained trapped, and leaders who used national sovereignty as protection from accountability. At the center of the draft, he placed the sentence that would define the entire address. "We cannot remain silent. Silence is not peace. Silence is permission." While the Pope continued writing, the diplomatic counterattack intensified. On Tuesday afternoon, the ambassador of one implicated nation requested an emergency meeting with Archbishop Giovanni Ferrara. The meeting lasted 45 minutes, and the warning delivered inside it was direct enough to leave little room for misunderstanding. The ambassador said that his government could downgrade its diplomatic relationship with the Holy See if the address proceeded. Vatican-affiliated aid organizations operating inside the country could be expelled, and other governments could be encouraged to take the same action. The threat placed Catholic personnel, humanitarian programs, and diplomatic access directly inside the conflict. Ferrara carried the warning to Pope Leo as soon as the meeting ended. The Pope answered without requesting more time or asking whether the threat was credible. He instructed Ferrara to tell the ambassador that if Catholic workers were expelled, he would personally travel there and stand in their place. Those around him understood that the statement was not intended as theater. They had watched him confront resistance during his years in Chicago and during the Vatican reforms of his first year as Pope. He had already decided that the papacy was not a position to be protected from consequences, but an office whose authority became meaningless when fear determined its limits. On Tuesday evening, 7 conservative cardinals drafted a private memorandum questioning the sources behind the 31-page dossier. They warned that unverified intelligence could be used to manipulate the Vatican's moral authority and turn the Pope into an instrument of a larger geopolitical struggle. The document reached Pope Leo XIV by Wednesday morning. Rather than reprimand them, he invited all 7 to lunch in the papal dining room. For 90 minutes he listened, asked questions, and acknowledged that 2 financial documents required stronger verification. He ordered both records checked through an independent channel, but he refused to postpone the address. When one cardinal proposed waiting indefinitely, Pope Leo set down his fork and reminded them that the Church had arrived too late to Rwanda, the abuse crisis, and other visible catastrophes. He said that he would not arrive too late again while he occupied the papal chair. The 7 cardinals left unconvinced in part, but none publicly opposed the speech. By Wednesday, the Vatican Communications Office had begun preparing for the consequences of the address. Media kits were assembled, background briefings were scheduled with trusted journalists, and translation teams began rendering the Pope's handwritten Italian text into 12 languages. The work was no longer theoretical because every department involved was now preparing for publication. At the same time, information was moving toward Rome through the Vatican's own international networks. Nuncios, bishops, missionaries, and Catholic aid workers across 130 countries were sending real-time reports from the regions described in the dossier. Those updates confirmed that the Southeast Asian displacement crisis had worsened during the previous week. New villages had been emptied, and a Catholic mission hospital had been forced to close. The report reached Pope Leo XIV on Wednesday evening and produced a reaction that those around him rarely saw. His anger remained quiet, but it immediately changed the document in front of him. He picked up his pen and added 3 new paragraphs to the address. The new section recorded the date of the hospital closure, the number of patients displaced, and the name of the military unit that had enforced the evacuation. Each detail was included so the government involved could not dismiss the account as a general accusation. The evidence came from the hospital's director, Sister Maria Consolata. She was a 67-year-old Filipina nun who had served at the mission for 23 years. Her testimony gave the Pope a direct witness whose identity, location, and service could be verified. Pope Leo ended the new section by addressing the implicated government directly. He asked, in whose name the authorities had closed a hospital that healed their own people, whose profit had been protected, and what justification could be offered before God and history. The speech had now moved beyond the original dossier, because new suffering was continuing while diplomats argued over the risks of naming it. By Thursday morning, May 18th, the address had reached 27 pages and would take approximately 40 minutes to deliver. It was scheduled for Friday, May 19th, before a special audience in St. Peter's Square. The Vatican was preparing for a public confrontation that could no longer be contained through private diplomacy. At approximately 10 in the morning, a secure message arrived from the North African government implicated in the famine case. It came through a retired general who had converted to Catholicism 15 years earlier and still maintained quiet ties with the Vatican. The government offered to reopen 2 border crossings within 48 hours and permit international monitors, but asked the Pope to soften the language directed at their nation. Pope Leo XIV consulted Archbishop Giovanni Ferrara and Cardinal Matteo Bruni, then prayed alone in his private chapel for nearly 30 minutes. He decided to acknowledge the concession publicly and praise it as an act of conscience. But he refused to remove a single criticism from the address. He explained that softening the truth for the government that responded would weaken the truth addressed to those that had not. The humanitarian opening would be recognized, but the responsibility behind the famine would remain in the speech. The government had made a concession, yet the Pope would not allow that concession to rewrite what had already happened. The address did not emerge from a single week of pressure. During his first year, Pope Leo XIV had tightened oversight of the Vatican Bank, created an independent ethics board with enforcement authority, and reassigned 16 bishops linked to financial irregularities. He had also opened direct channels with leaders from Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism for coordinated action on refugees and climate displacement. Each reform had strengthened the structure behind the decision now facing the world. The coming speech would not be a symbolic appeal from an isolated religious figure. It would be the public use of an authority the Pope had spent a year preparing to exercise. Governments and corporations named in the dossier were already moving. Crisis communication firms were being retained, lobbyists were seeking sympathetic coverage, and state-controlled media in at least 2 countries had begun attacking the Vatican's credibility. The Pope had expected the response and told Cardinal Matteo Bruni that his opponents would call him everything except what he was, a priest who had read a report and could not sleep. On Wednesday night, Pope Leo admitted that he did not know whether the address would succeed. Governments might act, companies might escape accountability, and the displaced, starving, and dispossessed might see no immediate change. But he knew what silence would produce, because silence guaranteed that nothing happened. On Friday, the doors of St. Peter's would open, the crowd would gather, and the cameras would turn toward the papal microphone. Pope Leo XIV would name the governments, identify the companies, and challenge the powerful to answer for what had been hidden. The world had been warned. The Church of Rome would no longer remain silent.